So welcome back to, I think, episode 12 of the Stormy Water Sessions, which is a little, either depending on how you're consuming this, a podcast or a YouTube video series. And it's between me, Ben Roberts, and my dad, Dave Roberts. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I wrote an article this morning, so I've been up quite a while, shall we say. And a small thing, but I'm wrestling with my phone's ability to record calls. So, such is life. Not a major issue in the great scheme of things, but yeah, I'm all right.
For the article, we'll be able to read that in a month or so, will we?
I think so. Yes, it looks at the predictions surrounding Trump getting a second term. And the fact that many of them did not come to pass, and how do we handle that? There are, without retailing the whole article to you, there's various ways of looking at it. One, why do people say these things, and what kind of is in their backstory that makes them think that that might be true, and that God is telling them to tell everybody? And then secondly, some people genuinely believe that they'd heard from God, so they said it. And some of them are apologising now and saying, well, I get it right most of the time, but this is not one of those times. And then just a bit of general advice for people, saying, yes, we're living in a group of fallible human beings here, and we will get it right quite a bit, but maybe we just need to weigh and test and think and reflect. And so yeah, a little bit of an honour to be asked to do it, but not an easy subject. A lot of hot potatoes in there. So.
Yeah, that will be in Christianity magazine in, well, presumably next month's edition or something, April or something. Yeah, that sounds good. But it isn't our topic today.
No.
So it's funny, Trump's just sort of, now he can't tweet. It's just like, it's just gone. Like, don't really hear, it's just gone from Trump every day for 4 years to almost like no Trump now.
The word on the street is that he's actually feeling much more relaxed in himself.
Yeah. Believe it. Yeah.
And then that he's sick of starting another party.
I think it would be some kind of a bit like the Tea Party was. It would be a sort of party within a party in the Republican Party, and they would primary people that he didn't like, basically.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that isn't what we're talking about today. That was just a bit of a preamble on the events of the last few months. But what we're actually going to sort of look at and reflect on today is the idea of loss, and particularly the idea of loss during this pandemic. Although a lot of the sort of lessons of it and kind of stories of it will be sort of reflected in other times and events and experiences that people have had, but particularly the idea of loss in the last year or so since this pandemic hit. And I think in the first instance, the loss of life, and the loss of life on a grand scale. Several million people worldwide, but then in particular nations, our nation, the United Kingdom being one of them, where that's been more significant than perhaps somewhere like Germany, although the second wave has affected them in certain ways that it didn't the first time round. But here, 100,000 people, over 100,000 people who were here this time last year and who aren't here now, and you can get into all of their, some of them wouldn't be here now anyway, and all that sort of thing. But the fact is, this disease came along and took them, and whether they might have lived another day or another 3 years or another 20 years, it took them before they might otherwise have been taken.
Yeah.
And I think, and we'll get on to the second part of that in a minute, which is the idea of loss on a sort of more personal micro level, but just on a wider level, that's got to affect how we sort of over the next few years kind of move forward as a nation, because almost everyone will know someone that's died from this thing. And it's a bit like, and you'll say, oh, it's only 100,000, there's 60 million people or whatever, but like with the troubles in Northern Ireland, the sort of only 4,000 people died in those years, but there's only sort of 1.8 million now, but probably when the troubles started, a lot less than that. So almost everyone knew someone that had died. Those 4,000 people that reflected out into that 1.5, 1.8 million population.
Yeah, I mean, if you take our own extended family, there was various ones that were injured or near bomb blasts. There was friends of the extended family who were the subject of attempted assassinations. One man who was actually killed by a sniper, and it comes close to you, even if it doesn't walk right up to your door. And I think the coronavirus is a little bit like that, in as much as the excess death totals, which is what people are measuring most of the time, are a very challenging thing. They're about 10 times what you would anticipate, and excessively hitting the over 80s. So quite a large generation of people in their 50s and 60s mourning the loss of their parents, and the impact of that then going down into the lives of 10, 20, 30, 40 people. And as you know, then it becomes an issue where it's not just a headline statistic, but it's something that has come into our own lives. But the headline statistic is probably a little understated as well, in as much as they only tend to, at this moment in time, report people who died within 28 days of test. Furthermore, there are people who are probably going to die of strokes, heart attacks, and related things because they didn't take themselves to or get taken to the hospital. And then there's this rolling tsunami of excess deaths over the next, probably 20 to 50 years, because some people will have been injured inside, able to carry on, but their life expectancy is going to drop, or they're going to be permanently semi-disabled for the rest of their life. And so there's this kind of this cost, this loss of life, but sometimes this loss of the freedom to live life the way that you anticipated it, because you've now got this chronic illness. And so objectively, something's happening out there. Sometimes even if you've not died or nobody you know's died or whatever, there is this kind of communal sense of this hard thing is lurking out there and it might get me. And it's already got quite a lot of people, and a kind of existential dread, really, and a kind of a melancholy where you think so many people suffering so much, and many times it came suddenly and took somebody they dearly loved and who they were in frequent contact with, not 3 times a year big events type contact, but every other day or every day or whatever. And so I don't think we should underestimate that. The question then becomes, what does the individual follower of Jesus and the expression of that in church communities, what do they actually do in response to that? And so one of the things I've written down here is just empathy, not being indifferent to other people's reality. And if you've had to passage any grief yourself, maybe on a smaller scale in a different situation, but just being aware of what other people are going through and having time for them, really. Sometimes people don't need to be sat down and given grief counselling. They just need to feel that they're not alone in the grief. So there's this aspect of solidarity. Call us if you want to. We know a little bit of what you're going through. We might not know all that you're going through, but we will listen. And then this practical support thing. People can get very frayed at the edges in the midst of loss, and sometimes help with the mundane things helps keep the balance so that they don't fall over. But there is a big cry in our culture. If you're a church leader and you're doing funerals, you're dealing with people at the sharp end of grief, and helping them process that. But it takes its toll, or even on you as a minister.
I think because obviously the nature of not being able to have any sort of large gatherings and or even small gatherings, so funerals having very few people there in person. And I just saw a tweet like an hour ago or something of somebody saying that they've just gone to their third Zoom funeral of the last year, basically. I mean, I don't know exactly how all those people died, but the idea of not being able to grieve properly, or perhaps be there as someone. There's somebody that I know who I think his mother passed away, and he wasn't really able to actually be there because of the restrictions on people in hospital and stuff. And then going through something else with another family member of his, and it just being like too much for him, basically. Because you can't even do the usual things that you might do to grieve and to kind of go through those processes and have some sense of, well, I've laid that person to rest, or I was there and I was able to have some last words with them or something.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's a bit of a hackneyed phrase, but we do benefit, I think, from closure in the culture of Northern Ireland, where I originate from. You would go and say goodbye to the person, and they'd be on a bed somewhere in the house, covered up, all arranged by the funeral guy. And then you'd walk the coffin down the road. But you would have seen them. You'd have had a moment, and then you'd have another moment when the actual burial or cremation took place. But there is a kind of a more concrete saying goodbye than, okay, they've gone, they're in that box, I'll never see them again. And for some people, not seeing them again is a comfort, because actually, but for others, seeing them again and saying goodbye is actually cathartic, important point of leaving and grieving.
I mean, I know we're not, we're humans and we're not animals, and there's various things that come along with being human. But even in the animal sort of kingdom, like if you've got two cats and a cat dies, but the cat that's alive didn't see it die, basically, you're supposed to bring it back and show him or her, the other cat, that this cat's dead, so that it doesn't keep looking for it. Basically.
Touring the district and feeling like they're abandoned.
Yeah.
So what are you saying earlier on about then it comes much closer to home? And I think we've touched on that a little bit.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I've written down here is that sometimes with these things, it can be a little bit tempting to be very helpful. And we can go in and helicopter around people in the midst of loss and almost give them a little checklist for their own good. And if we're aware of the 6 stages of grief, we might say, well, and I just wonder sometimes whether there's no set formulas with these things, but there's useful information to keep in mind. And so when you look at the 6 stages of grief, a couple of the things that they involve are, one is anger, another is denial, another is grief and grieving and tears and weeping. And that part of our job as friends, as community, and sometimes as church community, is to be available to people. And perhaps if they're articulating how they're feeling, say to them, often people go through this stage that you're going through, and kind of empathize and kind of just help them process what's happening to them, rather than, I really think you should cry now, or yeah, I know you're angry, but it's just, it's approaching the conversations with more than a sense of, oh dear, I don't know what to do. It is helpful, I think, and it's better to walk into the room and say, I'm not going to try and dictate exactly how this all unfolds, but I'm bearing in mind that they might be in these following 6 stages of grief. And so part of responding to loss is being ready to not impose a solution, but to bring explanation and understanding to people as they are going through the process. I think the other thing we have to think about is, what is the emotional background of the person who's lost somebody anyway?
I was just thinking that, because I mean, what the emotional background, the spiritual background, and these things might have a sort of link to one another or not. But
well, we have a Latin American family member who is quite emotional around the subject of death. She's recently lost friends to COVID, and deeply weepy. When one of my cousins died, my mum and dad just kept breaking down crying for the next several days. It was very unlike them. I didn't really quite know how to cope. But there'll be others who have a vision of masculinity, or a vision of being sensible, so to speak, who will absolutely cap their grief, and quite often will manage themselves until something happens, their guard goes down. And sometimes for people, it's weeks, months, years later, and they're in a flood of tears and they can't leave the house for a couple of days. And there is sometimes cultural expressions of grief that really help people move past it. But part of the challenge, if you're British or you come from some kind of emotionally controlled background, is, oh dear, I just need to stay sensible and stiff upper lip and, all that kind of stuff. And I'm not entirely sure that, that is helpful. Let's think about Jesus for a minute. And I was talking to somebody the other day, a lady called Sarah Hargreaves, and she writes about the emotions of Jesus. And she said when he got to the house of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, he wept by the tomb, and because Lazarus had died. And so some of the commentators are like, well, he was crying because they didn't have enough faith to see him rise from the dead. And she said, that's not really the explanation. The explanation is Lazarus was his friend. He was crying. The Saviour was crying for his friend. And Jesus wept over Jerusalem. And so sometimes we have to subject our cultural common sense to the reality of the emotional diversity of Jesus' life and say, sometimes we just need to let this stuff out of our system. We need to weep or laugh or cry or whatever it is that needs to happen, and not kind of bind ourselves up in a little set of rules about how we should be. Jesus was at times angry. He was at times emotional. He cried. I'm sure at times he was quite funny, as well as compassionate and caring and all those kind of things. So it's approaching these things through a lens of, I don't know it all, but the little bits I do know, if it's appropriate, I'm going to share them with this person.
And perhaps, I mean, if you're the person that is grieving rather than the person that's helping someone grieving, and perhaps if you're a Christian of sort of, you're a Christian, and you might be not sort of suppressing all of those things because you're like, well, I'm British and I've got to suppress them, but that you know where they've gone. You believe in something more than this life.
Yeah.
So you're sad because your friend or your family member isn't there, but you're not thinking, well, that's it, it's over.
Yeah.
Like, if they believed too.
Yeah. I think that's why sometimes Christian funerals can be. I mean, sometimes happens in other people's funerals as well, but they can be this incredible mixture of quite deep grief, weeping. You hear it all over the room. I went to the funeral in Slough of a lady where she was very well loved at the local college by the students. And so there was 1,000 people at the funeral. And when they started to play, she was a big fan of one of the boy bands, despite her advanced years. And they played one of their songs towards the end while she was being taken out, so to speak. And they were crying all over the room because they'd had a strong contact with this woman, but they also felt this kind of deep sense of loss that she'd gone. But in the same funeral, there was a lot of laughter, people telling stories about how she'd been and so on. And then this Christian thing about, well, in the future, we'll reconnect. And a lot of people are slightly, I don't quite know how to cope with that you can be genuinely, wrenchingly sad to see them go, but there's also joy about where they're going. There's also joy about a life well lived, and all of those kind of things. But yeah, it's a little bit of a unique thing. It's interesting in the time of coronavirus that in the plague years when they happen, Christians will often put themselves at the front line with medical stuff or whatever. And part of the thing is we've got to serve people like Jesus did. And the other part of the thing is we don't want to go, but if we do go, we know where we're going.
Which is, I think it made me think of that in Paul's writing in Philippians. And he's like, well, if I had a choice, I'd go. I'm in prison, but if they kill me, they kill me. Like, but in a way, that's the better option. But you guys are so useless, basically, that you need me. So I think I'll probably be staying.
Yeah. Oh, it's been hard work being an apostle because Jesus had been gone for a while, and everybody's like trying to stick their thing on him, and you're thinking, no, but me and the other disciples and the council at Jerusalem, and off in Corinth, they're like, oh, let's join this up with our mystery religion and just do what we like and sexual immorality and it's bad enough now. What was it like back then?
Well, I mean, I think I said this in one of our much earlier ones, but I think it was N.T. Wright, and he said, people go on as if now is like the most sort of flamingly
Bad.
immoral time to have been alive,
Yeah.
you know. But
Yeah.
um, I
It's a
think
myth.
we can get caught up in the idea that right now the present moment is sort of the worst things have ever been, and you know, perhaps in some respect that's true. You know, the climate is not looking good, you know, and things like that. But you know, it's funny how through the ages, you know, Victorian kind of certain thing, or at least our perception of what the Victorian era was like. But you know, I think we can sometimes view these things through certain spectacles. But
10%, 10% of the population had venereal disease in Victorian times. So, despite the fact that they're sort of looked upon as a prudish generation,
well, and yeah, and I think
whatever,
you might, well, you know, we're probably just looking at the prudishness of a particular class of people,
yeah,
because how many working class stories are getting told of the Victor or almost any of these eras? So
yeah, yeah, indeed.
and I'm not saying that.
So,
Anyway, yeah,
you were saying about the other kinds of loss, you know,
yeah.
because we kind of focused a little bit on death. What kind of things were crossing your mind?
I think there's a loss of and remind me, I think, because you wrote these down when I was saying them to you, and I
Well,
haven't
there's
written them
the
down anywhere,
teenage,
but I think
the
one of them
teenager and
was,
child thing.
yeah, sort of teenagers and children. So the loss of a lot of formative experiences, or which they may go through instead, you know, when they could do things again. Um, uh, but basically, for the best part of 12 months, apart from maybe a month or two in the summer, they haven't really been able to meet up with friends in the way that they might have done before. They haven't been able to sit exams. I mean, a lot of them are probably quite happy about that. But there's a whole bunch of things that you normally do when you're 15 or 16 or 14 or 12 or 7 um, that you're not, because you're just at home with your parents instead. So,
Yeah,
and some of those, like I said, you can replicate and do them later, but some of them it's sort of like, well, you know, I, I just haven't made the friends that I would have made, and
yeah.
you know,
I
it's
think it's particularly hard for people at transition points, if you see what I mean. So moving up to the big school at 11, moving up to the college at 16, uh, they're often quite challenging. The new set of associations, a new group of people, um, and to be going through COVID round about the time of those things, where it's an alienating experience at the best times, um, must be really challenging. I mean, I think kids are having a hard time not being at school, but sometimes it's because they're in a crowded house with the whole family. Sometimes it is that they just want to go out and play, you know, and do all the things that they would normally do. And it can be easy to understand why there's a negative effect on children. The other side of the coin is some of them are having the time of their lives, um, you know, because they didn't really like school anyway, and there's much less aggro in life at home, and so it'll be interesting over the next couple of decades to see how people refer back to those years and whether there'll be a mixture of good memories for some people and bad memories, or there's some people it will be like, well, actually, I really enjoyed that year, strangely enough, or it was dreadful. I just didn't know, you know, what was happening. I was concerned that things were worse than my parents were telling me, and you know, it'll
I
be.
think, yeah, I think even if you didn't like school, you know, it's gone on for so long now that it's not just about school though. It's, you know, you can't have your friend round or
Yeah,
whatever. I think, you know, uh I'm 36 tomorrow. So for me, it's been like, well, it's been incredibly frustrating, but I sort of I'm 35, so it's kind of a smaller portion of my life. But if you were 7 or something, I think you've probably watched this thing of one of my cousin's kids. Mum sent it to me a few weeks ago, with her talking across the dinner table and saying, remember 10 years ago when we could go to school and go to the shops and you didn't have to wear a mask and all of that. For people her age, or even for teenagers, or even people that are 21 or 22 or something, it's and I'm not sort of downplaying, like, it's been a pretty rough year all round, really. But for them, it must feel like devastating.
Yeah. So, I mean, children and teenagers, also adults, a loss that isn't about death or physical stuff, but a loss nevertheless. One of the things we talked about earlier was that, for some adults, they're going to lose some of their security around the companionship of work, the financial security of work, the rhythm of getting out of the house and coming up. And once again, we can very quickly respond and say, right, food insecurity, we'll make sure that you don't suffer that. We'll make sure that you get the best advice about your benefits, all of those kind of things. But for some people, the enforced slowness, quietness, isolation sometimes is kind of a devastating thing. And so there is a huge encouragement for people to engage the world every day in some form or fashion, volunteer somewhere, or go out for walks and runs and all of those kind of things, so that they don't fall into a spiral of despair. And so sometimes in our friendships with people, it's just getting them out of the house. And one of the things that's really important, I think, for everybody in their lives is this thing that they call self-forgetfulness, where you're not focused on your current status as a significant mental roadblock, because you have other things to do. You are able to constructively distract yourself, and there's a legitimacy in that constructive distraction, because being solitary is sometimes a really good thing, but we weren't created generally for being alone. We flourish when we're in good relationships and affirming relationships and all those things. So, and then I think the other thing that you mentioned, and it'd be good if you might expand on this bit, is the loss of moments, memories, support for others in their life transitions, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think
what are you thinking of the?
Well, I think it ties in with some of those other things, but perhaps more for, or more, not applying more to adults, but some of these things will apply a bit more to there's people that supposed to get married and postponed it twice, or we haven't been to see apart from Eastbourne, a couple of Eastbourne Town matches. We haven't been up to Charlton for nearly a year. I went to look at 2 flats in London on Saturday, and that was the first time I'd got on a train for nearly 11 months.
My word.
So, I mean, not that getting on a train is a memory, but it's almost like our lives have become incredibly like you're either doing one of about 3 things now, basically.
Eating. Sleeping.
But the sort of the seeing people, or the celebrations, or the birthday parties, or the meals, with other people other than people that you live with, mainly. They've all gone basically, and I guess we obviously we know that this won't last forever, so it's kind of really frustrating, but we know there will be an end to it. But even so, it's sort of it can be pretty sort of a pretty mundane time, put it mildly.
Those of you that are listening and thinking, why is there a thudding noise in the background? The guys who clean our windows are not letting the snow put them off, and they're currently cleaning the window of my office.
It's also about minus 2, I think.
Yeah, well, that's why I'm thinking surely they could have given themselves a day off this week. but
I think it's not going to get much hotter than this until the weekend. So maybe they thought they just got to get on with it.
I think the other thing, going back to current discussion, is, sometimes it's like for us, we got a guy who's 90 on Tuesday week, and so we're trying to make sure that everybody's got hats and streamers and whatever in their houses. And when we get on our Zoom call on Tuesday night, we're gonna whoop it up, which is no substitute for being there. But we will have delivered the chocolate cake and and everything else. And so there is an element of mourning the loss of the face-to-face, but trying to make as much of the electronically mediated community that we have. I've been following advances in church technology, and they are setting up things now where you can go into a virtual cafe, sit down with somebody, then press a button, and you pop up into a breakout room. So if you just want to have a chat with two people, which is almost impossible on the kind of Zoom screen where everybody's talking all over each other, you can have a bit of a chat just like you would, if you were an ordinary cafe or a church after the meeting, all that kind of stuff. And of course, it's nothing like the real thing, but there is an attempt to replicate some of that so that people don't lose that support or those memories. When we let all the poppers off and the hats go on Tuesday week, it will be a memory. It will be something we'll hold on to. Do you remember when Ken was 90?
Mm-hmm.
And so, whilst we always acknowledge the reality of this disjointedness and brokenness and separation and all of those things, we're always trying to make something out of what we've got in front of us. Interesting, a lot of people you talk to used to write to people. And it's a strange concept, isn't it? But your man, Mumford, in Mumford & Sons, he's married to
Karen Mulligan.
And what was their initial point of contact? They were pen friends.
Yeah, because she lived in the States. Yeah.
And right? So sometimes we can have mediated experiences which aren't quite being face-to-face, but are part of the discourse that takes place between us. And, and of course, if you're on WhatsApp, you're always getting little videos and all the rigmarole, and some of which are genuinely funny. I don't know if you saw the one the other day with the kid at school saying his numbers for the BBC, for the TV presenter, and he got up to 8, and the bloke said, "Can you not go any higher?" And the kid goes, 1, 2.
I think I've seen that, yeah.
And we could just slip in a dad joke here. Why did Adele cross the road?
Why did the what? Sorry?
Adele cross the road.
Oh, why did Adele cross the road?
So she could sing Hello from the Other Side, which is the title of one of her more famous tracks for those of you that are not a fan of Adele. Anyway, Ben was deeply underwhelmed by that joke. Did you see his facial expression there? So yeah, I think there is this element, and I think it's part of this wider thing about how we're called to mourn with those who mourn and rejoice with those who rejoice, and that there's a time for laughter, there's a time for tears, and all of those kind of things, and that we always want to hold those in tension and not downplay either, because I think it's part of our emotional health. I went to one of my cousin's funerals many years ago, and he died in quite tragic circumstances, and weeping in the front room was just wrenching. But in the back room, drinking tea, they were telling stories from the previous 40 years, and I was helpless with laughter. And part you're feeling guilty, you're thinking, my cousin's there in the front room. But actually, that was the emotional strength. There was an ability to genuinely mourn, and an ability to genuinely laugh mostly about the family's back history, and the memories, going back to the memories that you talked about. And I think that's a mark of the Bible too. When you read the Psalms, there's exultant rejoicing and deep lament, and they can be held in tension. They don't have to be exclusive of each other. Are we done?
I think we are, yeah. Unless you've written down anything else that I said that we would talk about.
I think that pretty much covers it. You've had jokes, you've had window cleaners disrupting our broadcast. You've had everything today. So
a bus going by me on the left there now. I don't know if you can hear that. So do you want to do the Lord's Prayer for us, or any other prayer that you might feel appropriate?
Indeed. I think I'm quite keen on the Aaronic blessing, as they say, which comes from the book of Numbers, and it says, "May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you. May he grant you mercy and peace." And so, if you've been watching, listening, and taking in what we've been doing, we ask that God would confer his peace upon you and give you rest. Amen.
Amen. And also, if you're me, then your gran writes that in various greetings cards to you every year or so.
Me as well. Right, have you switched off the recording?
I'm